Now that we have talked about this subject pertaining to Pixar, we really need to dive into Disney animation with something vastly underrated, which is obviously pertaining to the anti-villain, the ones who have good motivations for the most part but are still technically against the hero in some form. We're thinking about it in terms of Disney storytelling is something unique since their best are cultivated in the image of pure evil, including those who think that they are right or supposedly using the Most High, like Frollo. Villains you wouldn't expect have redeeming traits or qualities at all, because they just aren't. So when you speak of something like that, which most of us really know in the brand of Disney villains, then how would you expect anti-villains to even exist or work in this particular realm? Well, it's actually not hard to find if Pixar is able to present them by what is shown, where there's actually quite several, including ones I've featured on previous lists with the majority involving twist. Because this does not have to pertain to main villains at all if a story is featured in a different form because of what nature they truly have on the side that should be generally be good. Because they also don't have to be regarded as antagonists either in its main definition and just have more of the antagonistic traits, where 4 of them actually have gotten redeemed by the end, consisting of those like Amos Slay, Denahi, John Silver, and Taka, all of which will be featured in this video heavily alongside many others you wouldn't have thought of before. Where starting off, I would actually want to begin and talk about Denahi from Brother Bear in that case. This is a character I really haven't talked a lot about in the past and ignored in the part of Disney villains because of the fact he's not a Disney villain at all. Yes, he is the main antagonist of the film concerning he does go against his brother Kenai, but that's only because he doesn't know it's him at all. It's about a switch perspective in Kenai's eyes, you might say, when he caused the death of Koda's mother. At the beginning of the film, we see that they are all brothers who teased each other as much as anyone else would, with Sitka being the oldest balance in between as a family. You also have to remember that he is the old narrator at the very start of the film, telling the very story to newer generations of the events that took place in his life. We see over the course of events that things change his heart from being a mischievous middle brother to a serious one because of the death of his brother Sitka at first, not wanting Kenai to go after or blame the bear for his brother's death because of Kenai's recklessness. But of course he doesn't listen and he goes confronts Koda's mother and kills her, getting punished by the spirits for his actions, turned into a bear like the totem showed. In this part, Denahi tries to see what happened but only sees the spear and clothes and the bear version of Kenai, whom he thought killed his brother without knowing it's actually his brother. That his actions and shift against his own brother are just very understandable from a shorter perspective that didn't actually see anything at all, losing all of his family in the process, which can send people into deep dark places like he does show right here. It is also a reflection of the punishment Kenai has to go through because of his very actions, where his brother is actually seeking to kill him out of vengeance that he actually told Kenai not to do in the first place. One done so he can go with Koda to learn the importance of family and brotherhood in this case, where he just basically made a villain out of his brother when we know he shouldn't at all and doesn't show he deserves to be one at all. And thus, that actually makes him fit for being the anti-villain role over the course of the story, with the spirit of Sitka coming back to turn Kenai human at the end and stop the fight when the Northern Lights were there, affirming to us that all of them were actually good men and needed to actually learn over the course of time, redeeming themselves in the process, accepting where they needed to go in life. This is actually the best simple example you could have where you don't really think such a story like Brother Bear would have the typical Disney villain, but still found a way to make it work with this interesting concept and having the brother be the misunderstanding villain. At least much better than what Disney would fully do to ignore or twist the existence of villains at all. And the next small example would in fact be Taka, who is in fact Te Fiti, being the goddess of life in Moana, where you already know, because of that, she represents everything that is good until her heart is taken away from her, melting her into the fire goddess of Taka because of the fact Maui stole her heart, stopping any life from getting to her island and effectively slowly degrading all the other islands ever since. Because when you think about it, volcanoes are actually known to shape the land but also cause destruction in their wake, where the story actually has a variety of different villains to make up for her as the main threat in the traditional Disney sense, done by their most renowned directors. Taka is also very similar to other anti-villains in the sense that they have no sense of anything, that they are mostly emotionless creatures acting on their abilities, since she really doesn't have a heart in this case. The reason why you have to say that Taka is an anti-villain other than being Te Fiti herself, who is good-hearted in nature, is the fact that Taka still has that Te Fiti inside of her even without her own heart, where you see when the call Moana did when she sang "Know Who You Are" calmed her down along the way and allowed herself to be restored in the process. So even while she mainly acts with the agents of chaos and destruction expression being bitter at Maui and the entire world, there still is a well-intentioned heart inside, even if the heart is actually not there. I mean, words cannot express how much I love this one because of how the world of Moana is formed, where life cannot exist without the heart and soul and the passionate desire to sacrifice for others in some type of way, where you could see that bit where Te Fiti is a reflection of Moana herself by her own green face. That as the hero of the story, you can also actually be the villain in a double reflection when she deals with a lot of self-doubt in her own heart. Or if you think about it in that way, then I guess you could say heroes can be anti-villains if it's shaped up like how this movie portrays. And moving on is where we have to talk about one villain who's been featured in other videos fitting the main mold of an anti-villain, being Amos Slay from The Fox and the Hound. This is an example of someone who counts as a main Disney villain in some form, but also not really being a typical Disney villain if you get the point of him being the main antagonist, which I featured on my ranking list before. He's a hunter who really doesn't believe what he does is actually bad and just a bit cranky at times, enough to put him at odds with the relationship of Todd and Copper, where you just can't see him as an evil person at all by his attitude in the film. I mean, yes, there is a villainous attitude to him that attempts to keep our heroes apart from the worlds they come from, but it clearly doesn't come out of the nature of a villain portrayed like Jafar or Ursula, where it actually comes from this misunderstanding, just like other anti-villains, of how he thought Todd was after his chickens and so forth of other events. So he has to go after him being a wild animal that disturbs his own peace, where the main villainous threat of this film is obsession, or at least the unhealthy side of it that allows us to act on dangerous things pertaining to something that is overall good. How events on the surface allows us to act irrationally on the bad side of things rather than the good, almost resulting in our own deaths, be it by the end of the film with the bear, which of course leads to the ending and his redemption as the antagonistic threat, realizing what happened with Copper protecting Todd. It's within this moment we see how chasing after certain things just aren't worth it anymore by the actions demonstrated by a few, a circumstantial villain created out of misunderstandings rather than a clear conscious decision by one single individual. And I think that is something we can truly appreciate this era of Disney did during their darkest period of animation, when most people didn't think they might have survived before the Renaissance. That sometimes, especially in cases of Disney, stories can present themselves without having that traditional threat, but how it still needs one in order to sell its theme in some way. Like, what would be the point of The Fox and the Hound if it didn't have a threatening force to tear both of them apart? It just wouldn't work like most of their modern films have without any villains at all and just tend to be nothing, hence why I wanted to talk about these specific characters in the first place. But before we talk about the best anti-villain Disney has ever produced, is where we actually have to take a detour into modern times with Encanto, a story that also doesn't have a villain at all, except for the facts of the traits of one Alma Madrigal, who technically serves the antagonistic traits in the film for the family. Where the interesting thing about what I just said and her character is the fact that she really isn't an antagonist at all. I mean, sure, we'll go through some of the characteristics in the film, but she still really isn't and actually listed as the deuteragonist of the film, the second main character next to the protagonist on the good side because of the fact that she is the leader of the family. Everything about this film is structured around her, and Mirabel is of course a part of that as the current generation of kids that followed from her own parents. But this counts of course as an anti-villain because she is a perfectionist that expects more out of her own family with the gifts they have, and how Mirabel goes forgotten because she doesn't have such gifts like her abuela would want. And it's something that is very real for lots of families, for what is expected or put on others, making things like Isabella the Golden Child, having those favorites and then harshly judging someone based on our own mistakes, neglecting even her own children like Peppa with her problems that her gift could make even worse, or the fact that Bruno left the family. It's one that really fits all the billings of what is to come with the anti-villain, having those overall good intentions but still acting bad in regards to the problems that her own family is facing, and our main protagonist who seeks to help them all, including her the most. This is where you have to put fear as the main villain of the entire film that causes her to become an anti-villain in this case, because of the fact she loves her family dearly but acts out of circumstance of that fear, losing it all when the cracks appear both physically and mentally within their own heart in the house. Where if one does not have the ability or expectation or negative attribute in their view, she immediately wipes that out of her mind and ignores that completely, thus making the situation much more worse, culminating in Mirabel's confrontation that literally brings the whole house down. Because before that, she also berated her based on the fact that she was the one doing these things, not making her sister Isabella perfect anymore, being who she really is is, or her other older sister Luisa losing her super strength dealing with the pressure that she herself upheld, where you see the order the hero is trying to restore to bring the family together, but the villain of misunderstanding just tries to make it worse or makes it harder to do so. And that's where we see her realize herself that she was the problem with her own family, finally crumbling under such pressure with Casita being destroyed, and broken, bringing such fears into reality, but then going back to confide in Mirabel the truth that she is the one who broke her family because of the pain of the past of losing her own Pedro and her own former home. Where both our protagonist and deuteragonist come together to try and fix it, to realize those mistakes and what the miracle truly meant, being ourselves. That we learn to start treating each other as a family rather than a machine of perfection that constantly needs to perform unrealistic expectations, because that's not healthy at all. Where she truly is the greatest representation of an anti-villain in a story that does not want a villain, just as much as I said with Brother Bear. Fulfilling a certain role that is required, just like how most Disney journeys take place for its hero, compared to other ones that lack without or just don't make much sense either way. But then again, there is only one that can fulfill all roles to become Disney's ultimate anti-villain to me. One regarding someone who can be both a villain and also not be a villain. And if you were paying attention before, then you already know who that person is, pertaining to certain characters who get redeemed at the end, just like most of the ones I just mentioned, being of course John Silver from Treasure Planet. John Silver is a villain that covers a lot of ground for the relationship he made with Jim. And like I said, you can count him both regularly as a villain as such mentioned, because he still seeks a goal that most normal villains would search for, just like the original Treasure Island, leading a story and a band of pirates against the crew because of the treasure Captain Flint held, but also having a heart that most villains usually lack. Something you see formed over the course of the journey with their interactions in the bond and relationship that Jim Hawkins never actually had in his life because his real father left him and his mother. We're talking about his villainous side more beforehand is one that isn't completely evil. Sure, he has his moments being the strong leader, but he's still one that is committed to less violence as possible and still has a bit of honor in him, especially if things go wrong for the hero. Focus on the mutiny and the treasure he seeks, but above all, he just seems to love Jim, protecting him against the other mutinous members and whatnot, where he really just wants the best for him, only threatening him after he turns it down because of his own actions, but never really actually committing to such action. Where out of all the Disney villains you've ever seen, this is probably the only one you can truly say that makes you cry or feel emotional in a good way because of how encouraging he is to our hero. The opposite feeling any villain would ever do, where it just works really well. But the height of his anti-villain characteristic comes near the very end when Treasure Planet is collapsing due to Flint's booby trap, where he has to make the ultimate choice between this gold of riches and Jim Hawkins, the boy he actually learned to develop a relationship with. Where as a normal villain, this could be the best opportunity to defeat the hero and twist the story for the worse, but how he actually isn't that kind of villain at all and chooses the opposite to save him and the remainder of the crew. A heart that demonstrates much more than the fulfillment of the antagonist of the story that tussles back and forth with both ideas with his personality if one were to succeed. Of course, even though he does redeem himself at the end through these actions, it still doesn't absolve him of any of the villainous crimes he performed, where he still tries to escape from justice for what he actually earned as intended from the beginning, but not before Jim gives a heartful goodbye, giving more to him at the end. Of course, not before he actually wanted him to join on new adventures, but declines because he needed to chart his own course and choose his own life inspired by a certain man who fulfilled the role he was missing for most of his life. Where of course, parting ways, he does give him the thing he was searching for since the beginning of the film, giving enough money to rebuild the inn. Where in a way, like I've mentioned before with Pixar's anti-villains, they still all win at the end in their own right, both the hero and the villain, where this pertains to the freedom to live life the way you wanted and the encouragement to move on. Where there is just so much to talk about regarding John Silver that makes him such a great villain, or anti-villain in this case, where he should be appreciated for all those elements that are much more than what a normal villain would particularly cover, including one who is and isn't a villain to be called an anti-villain as much as anyone else on this list. Where as we can see by the end, sometimes Disney stories can move away from the traditional image of villainy without abandoning it completely to some degree and still create new interesting ideas to move forward, all for the prevailing idea of good conquering all that is evil within our own hearts if we know or don't know it at all. And even though various movies can work regardless of having villains at all, it still is much more impactful if they still do it in some way with the journey the hero takes for the good of us all. And having those who are good but still do bad things over the course of time just seem like a great effective way to hammer such a point into the ground if needed be. Where I also know there might be more out there that Disney has done that I didn't include and hope others can find that for the benefit of wonderful storytelling for all time. And I'm all done, so goodbye.